Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a second. Welcome to Politics and Prose Live. Thank you for joining us in this digital format. We're here tonight with our author, Barry Lynn, who's here to discuss his new book, Liberty from All Masters. And you can purchase a copy of that in our chat. I posted a link that'll take you to Politics and Prose's website. We really encourage everyone to purchase a copy of the book. It's a great way to support our author and to also support your local independent bookstore. Secondly, the latter portion of tonight's event is going to be devoted to your questions, and we highly encourage everyone to ask a question. And you can do that by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can also use our chat to discuss the event with each other, but we ask that you keep your questions to the Q&A box. It just makes things a little bit easier. And with all that said, tonight I am honored to introduce Barry C. Lynn. He is the founder and CEO of the Open Markets Institute in Washington. He is also the author of Cornered in 2010 and End of the Line from 2005. Tonight, he'll be discussing his new book, Liberty from All Masters, The New American Autocracy versus the Will of the People. The book tackles one of the biggest threats to liberty in America, the rise of modern monopolies and the resulting concentration of economic power. Lynn argues that these monopolies not only attack our economic liberties, but our personal ones as well. This is compounded by the rise of tech monopolies like Google and Amazon that increasingly shape our lives. Tonight, Barry is going to be in conversation with Stacy Mitchell, the co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, a national research and advocacy organization that fights corporate control and works to build thriving, equitable communities. Barry and Stacy, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you so much. It's just absolutely terrific to be having this conversation in the context of politics and prose. Independent businesses and independent bookstores are an integral part of democracy. They're really sacred institutions in our democracy, and both very much affected by the issues we're going to talk about tonight, and really key to building the fight to push back against corporate power. So really great to be here. Barry, I want to start. The book is just absolutely terrific and, reflects your journalism background in terms of being a really well-reported and just terrific storytelling, as well as just a powerful and incredibly timely book about what we're facing. I want to start with the title, Liberty from All Masters. Liberty is really a terrific word. I think when most people think about Amazon, Google, Facebook, monopoly power, they think about it in terms of the economy. But you are right at the start talking about this in terms of democracy. Why do you think these companies are a menace to democracy?
That's a great question, a great way to start. Before I actually get to that, I just do want to thank Politics and Prose for, first for being Politics and Prose, one of the truly great bookstores in America, and a store that has served as a foundation for a great debate that has gone on here in Washington year after year after year. And then also really thank you, Stacy, for coming and doing this. It's for those of you who don't know Stacy's work, Stacy's one of the true heroes of the anti-monopoly, pro-democracy movement in America today. Stacy and I started working together 2006, it was probably. So it's really a great honor to be doing this with you, Stacy. But the title, it's what I was trying to get at with that is that there's really, it's an old saying, and we could trace it back to Lincoln, we could trace it back beyond Lincoln in American history, and it's basically that there's really only two types of liberty. And there's either liberty for the person who wants to control and manage and manipulate other people, for the powerful person, or there is liberty for everybody from being controlled and manipulated and exploited in some way by powerful people. And you cannot have both of those liberties simultaneously. And what I was trying to get at with that is that for most of our history in America, we worked really hard to have liberty for everybody, from control and manipulation and authoritarian sort of actions. And for the last 35 years, 40 years, we've really been subject to a different philosophy. And it's time for us to wake up to this philosophy that is so fundamentally subversive of the, basically the original idea of America. And this was sort of, we can talk more about this later, but, neoliberal, some people call it libertarianism, some people call it Chicago School, but I think neoliberal competition philosophy, which is sort of really taken our country in a radically different direction than it has been on for most of our history. And it's taken us to what is perhaps the most dangerous time in our democracy since the Civil War, and where we are facing the most powerful corporations in history. And thus far, we have not beaten them.
Mm-hmm. You gave a speech recently, last week, I think, at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and you talked about this neoliberalism idea that took over in the 70s, and described it really as a coup against democracy. Can you talk a little bit about what that shift was and how it took hold? What was it about that time period that enabled such a change in how we approach these issues?
Yeah, it's in our country, anti-monopoly, we sometimes, those of us who, studied our history books, we say, oh, anti-monopoly goes back to the Sherman Act in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act. Anti-monopoly is, if you really read the founding documents closely, if you read the Declaration, you read the Constitution, you read the Northwest Ordinance, maybe we'll get to talk a little more about that. Those three documents right at the beginning of our country were all fundamental anti-monopoly documents. Basically, they established the foundations for individual liberty. They established the foundations for democracy as we know it today. They gave to the people, and the people shaped those tools to give to themselves the ability to protect ourselves and our communities from concentrated power. We used those remarkably well over the course of 200 years. It was imperfect at the beginning. It was grossly imperfect. There was the founding. There was a compromise between as we know, between a system of slavery and then this idea of freedom. And we have to keep that in mind every day. That has never been fixed, but we have, for 200 years, we took things in the right direction, always sort of expanding the empire of liberty, always bringing more people into the world of liberty. But what happened is, 35, 40 years ago, this entirely different philosophy was sort of embraced, and it was embraced in this very subtle, very roundabout way. And this was basically, it was just these guidelines that were used to interpret how do we see competition in our society? How do we understand the purpose of anti-monopoly laws and policies in our society? And for 200 years, we said, well, the purpose of anti-monopoly is, protect the liberty of the citizen, protect our democracy. And then in the 1980s, under the early days of Reagan, folks came in and said, oh no, the purpose, the philosophy should be to promote the welfare of the consumer. And we're going to do so by promoting efficiency, because what does the consumer want? The consumer wants more stuff. So the way to promote the welfare of the consumer is by allowing people to seek greater efficiency. And it was basically a trick, a euphemism for to trick people into allowing incredible concentration of power and control. And so we've run America now according to this new set of rules. We've run America according to this new set of rules for 35 years. And today we wake up and we look around and we say, this is not the country that we read about in our civics books. This is not the country that, existed, 50 years ago, 40 years ago. What happened? Our democracy is upset. Our healthcare systems are upset. Our trading system is has created all of these dangers for us that didn't used to exist. How did this happen? And actually, we could trace almost every ill that we face today back to that decision in the early 1980s to replace the American system of liberty with a system that was designed to promote control and concentration of power. And that's what the neoliberal idea was. It was, we want to make power, we want to establish power in the hands of the few. It was an anti-democratic coup.
A lot of people, I think part of that mindset of being a consumer is that we tend to look at Google and think, well, this is a convenient search engine and boy, it helps me get where I want to go. And we tend to look at Amazon as the company that puts something on our doorstep in 2 days and so on. Talk a little bit about how people experience monopoly power in their lives, and particularly the power of the tech companies. How does this actually manifest on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, it's we tend to, and actually this is a legacy of that change in philosophy back in the early 1980s. So what the Reagan administration did, what sort of these scholars who were responsible for this, people like Robert Bork, what they said is, don't think of yourself as a citizen, think of yourself as a consumer. And when you think about the harms of power, you should only think about them in terms of how they affect you as a consumer. So for many years, what we saw is that as people concentrated power, they would like throw a few pennies at the consumer and say, if you, here, in exchange for this monopoly you've given us, this 60% market share or 70% market share, we're going to throw a few pennies at you in terms of lower prices, and you should be happy with that. And for 40 years, people were trained to do so and to see themselves mainly as consumers. But what's happened is that these same corporations, which sometimes give us a few pennies, but actually usually don't, usually are ripping us off in real life, they also have concentrated power on us as sellers of services, sellers of goods, sellers of crops, sellers of labor, of work. So all of us are bringing something to market. All of us are bringing ideas to market, or some tomatoes we grew, or we're bringing our could be sweeping skills or warehousing skills or doctoring skills to a market. And when there's only one buyer in that market, that buyer is going to use its power in ways that harm you. They're going to pay you less. They're going to treat you less well. They're going to cut your benefits. They're going to manipulate you. They're going to spy on you. And the more power they have over you, the more they're going to do all these things. And we have one of the revolutions that we've seen in this country is like just wages. This is, about this, you've read about this. It's wages in America now across the board are down, 20%. There's studies that show that it's down 20% or more compared to how it would be without this kind of consolidation. 20%. That's, for the average family, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars that you're getting less than you would otherwise because of this concentration of power. For a lot of families, it's more than that. It could be, in some regions of the country, it's 30% plus. So that's just one example of how, because we've accepted a few pennies, we focused on our lives as consumers. We've been happy when these folks say, hey, you know what? The price of a book, we're going to give it to you for a nickel off. Well, in exchange, they've taken about, $2 or $3 or $5 out of the hide of somebody, and they're giving you a nickel. You turn that into a system, a society, and that's a society that is bad for everybody in it.
One of the, of course, obvious consequences of that we see everywhere is the loss of independent businesses, shrinking market share, family farms going by the wayside, independent retailers, bookstores, grocers. I think a lot of people look at that and think, well, it's sort of the price of progress. They couldn't quite compete. How do you think about independent businesses? Like, how should we be thinking about them?
Yeah, and this is, I mean, I'm glad to talk, I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you especially about this. I mean, ILSR is, for many years was the organization that has, and continues to be the organization that fights for independent business, explains the importance of independent business better than any other group in America. I know, Stacy, you've done amazing work with the American Booksellers Association, with Orrin Tyker and Allison Hill over the years. And, and so, and I've learned a lot, from, working with you. But the fundamental thing about, independent business is it's not just mom and pop on Main Street. It's having citizens who are sitting on properties that they control, like little family-sized properties, and it's because what this comes down to is it's both on the consumer side, what you buy, where you go to buy stuff. You want to have local stores. You benefit from having many local stores. There's better variety. There's better service. There's a true community. But what we also benefit from is having more and more truly independent citizens, people who take care of themselves, who exist in the market, and they are beholden to no one except the people who buy from them. They don't have, they're not a clerk in a large corporation. They're not just a manager in some other person's and in some bank's chain store. They actually they control their own destinies. And going back to the founding of our nation, there was a sense that not everybody's going to be a store owner, not everyone's going to be an independent farmer, but the more independent farmers and the more independent store owners and the more independent business people there are, the stronger our whole society will be, and the more people will understand how to go out and fight for true democracy, and the kind of democracy that's made from the bottom up by people who want to bring their ideas and their goods and their services to market, which just means it's just another word for exchanging with their neighbors, just making a society and sharing everyone's capacities with one another. So that's the fundamental importance of independent businesses. It's what makes our democracy in many respects.
I obviously couldn't agree more. And I do feel like so we try to sort of find COVID has been very revealing. And I think as people see and experience the loss of independent businesses and think about what that's going to mean, there's a newfound awareness that small businesses are not some sort of marginal part of the economy that don't matter, but they're very much instrumental to all of the things that you talked about and to the well-being of our communities.
There's an important part about this, which is that there's a lot of evidence that independent businesses, independent farms are actually much more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Americans for 200 years said efficiency fundamentally doesn't matter. What matters is democracy. But what we also got from that system of small holders, of independent businesses and independent farms, is a much more efficient system. People used each acre of land more efficiently. People used each a foot of shelf in the store more efficiently. When you own it, you care for it. When your shadow falls upon it, you end up with a system that where people take more care of it than a chain store can, and also there's a much more opportunity for innovation.
Mm-hmm.
For bringing new ideas into these systems, new types of crops, new types of services, new types of goods. So, for years, for 2 centuries, independent business has been often attacked by the bankers, by the big corporations as inefficient. And many people have believed that. And that's just BS. It's like, in certain respects, at certain times, certain corporations create certain efficiencies. But generally across the board, a system of small independent businesses in most of the key important ways is better for us economically as well as politically.
One of the points that you've made in particularly in a past book, The End of the Line, is that it's also really critical to resilience. And we have seen, COVID, my goodness, suddenly we've got shortages of meat. We've got, we're unable to make face masks. It's just sort of stunning the degree to which even on these sort of strictly economic, like the basic measures of, does your economy work? Can it produce the stuff you need? Things seem to be falling apart.
Yeah, things are falling apart. And that's actually one of the problems with monopoly. Monopoly, when you combine monopoly means you put everything in one place. You put it under one roof. When you have a monopoly that is run by rapacious capitalists, once they've gathered everything under one roof, they're going to slowly, or perhaps quickly, destroy everything that's under that one roof because they want to extract the cash. So at the sort of large scale level, what we have right now is a perfect system for destroying the machines, the industrial arts, the infrastructures that we depend on to live. So here we are. We're in COVID. It's like we're waking up and it's like, oh, wait, we don't have the capacity to make 10-cent N95 masks. We don't have the capacity to make 20-cent tests that will save hundreds of thousands of lives and trillions of dollars of economic activity. How did that happen? Why is there so much confusion in our science? Why are our hospitals, where did all the beds go? Why are there so few hospitals? We wake up and suddenly we find out, well, corporations came in and stripped away all our hospitals. They stripped away the rural clinics. They took the machines that we used to make face masks and they shipped them to China, and then and they destroyed the ones that were here in America. They took the capacity to make pharmaceuticals and they shipped it to China, and they allowed the Chinese to create choke points so that when they want to, they can disrupt the flow of these of vital pharmaceuticals to Americans. This didn't just happen. There was no market that sort of decreed this. This was done by monopolists, and it poses. We talked about the political threat here, but it's like what monopoly has done is actually it's taken us to the edge of collapse in many of these systems. And it is, if the threat to us is not that we would just lose our democracy, it's also that we, perhaps not COVID, but something soon will knock this down in a way that we can't pick it up again.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn to potential, what is the solution? What is the fight that we need to have? And I met you, 15 years ago, and you had written a piece for Harper's Magazine about Walmart's power. And at that time, you were one person in Washington, going around in Washington D.C. talking to people about the problem of monopoly. And a lot of people, I think, probably looking at you strangely at that time. And last week, the House Judiciary Committee released the findings and recommendations of a 16-month investigation into Amazon, Apple, Google, and Facebook into their monopoly power. That's an extraordinary report that finds rampant, that these companies are incredibly dominant, that the impacts are far and wide, that they abuse that dominance, that it's a threat to democracy, and also makes a series of strong recommendations about reinvigorating our anti-monopoly policy, including breaking these companies up. That's quite a distance to come in 15 years. And, you know, congratulations on being an early, like Paul Revere, in calling out this problem and really, really being an instigator of that movement that has led us to this place. But I'm curious what you thought of the report. I obviously found it thrilling, and where you think it might lead. Where do we go next?
Yeah, it's, you know, it was a long 15 years, and, you know, you and I were standing on the street. I remember that conversation well. I'm like saying, oh, there's another person. And, you know, there was, you know, and there were a few others back then. And, you know, it's, so we, you know, you and I were not alone in this, but there just weren't many of us. And it has, you know, it's sometimes seems like just yesterday, but sometimes it really seems like a long haul. But the people should understand is, like, you know, what we're talking about can seem really depressing. It is depressing. It's terrifying. The power that Google, Facebook, and Amazon have is, you should be terrified. We have no choice but to break these companies up. We have no choice but to neutralize their power. You know, you know, we're going to do it. And one of the reasons that we're going to do it, or one of the reasons I'm confident we're going to do it, is because of this report that came out last week from the House Antitrust Subcommittee. And it was Chairman Cicilline, David Cicilline from Rhode Island, who is one of the true heroes. I mean, 100 years from now, there will be chapters in books about the Cicilline Committee and the fundamental role that Chairman Cicilline played, and his team, Lena Khan and Slade Bond and a few others, played in sort of organizing this investigation, the series of hearings, and then and writing this incredibly important book, which is really, it's a blueprint for making democracy in America in the 21st century, remaking it in the era of Google, Facebook, and Amazon. So it's, you know, you and I were talking about this earlier. It's a bit, you know, in some ways it's, you know, we sort of set out on a mission a long time ago, and the first stage of that mission, we can now say, mission accomplished. It's, you know, and we don't have to stand on an aircraft carrier and do it. I mean, it's like this was an amazing thing that happened last week. Too few people in America really paid attention to this. That we will learn it over time. But you know, we still have so much to do. We have to actually go in and take apart Google, Facebook, and Amazon, Apple. We have to, and once we finish with those, or begin to really get into those, we have to look at all these other sectors that have been monopolized. But what we saw last week is someone say, hey, I see Godzilla clearly. They said, hey, look, Godzilla is terrifying, but we have all of the weapons. We have the sword that we can use to kill Godzilla. And that committee stood there and said, we are going to kill Godzilla and make America safe for all citizens in the 21st century. And the fight ain't done yet, but that's the way to start the fight the right way.
There seem to be some, you know, people aren't used to seeing Congress involved in anti-monopoly, you know, and I think there's some language, you use the word monopoly and anti-monopoly quite a lot. And then there's the word antitrust describing a body of law. And, you know, antitrust is, a lot of people think of as a very kind of technical thing. And it's very specific measures of market power and this and that and markets and so on. And is something that's carried out by these specialists at these agencies and so on. And they do a lot of it behind closed doors. And so there seemed to be some people who reacted to this, like feeling like it was a little jarring and maybe political for Congress to be engaging in this, question about, do these companies have too much power? And then the idea of Congress taking action. Help us understand that, like in the context of history. What do you think about that reaction?
Yeah, I mean, it's fundamentally important for all of us to relearn is that all anti-monopoly law comes from, the American federal anti-monopoly law comes from Congress. Actually, much of our state law was established by Congress. Congress in 1913, with the Clayton Antitrust Act, said, hey, every state in the union has the same power as the federal government, because sometimes the federal government's going to be captured by bad people, by large corporations, or maybe by presidents who we don't trust, who will misuse power. So we're going to establish this power in every state of the union so that the people always have a sword at hand. If not at Washington, then in their state capital. There's always a sword at hand. So what has happened is, years ago, actually beginning in the last century, Congress began to establish agencies. And when Congress establishes an agency, they're basically giving a piece of their power. They're putting their power into an organization. They're saying, use this power on our behalf. It's like, we can't keep track of this issue on a day-to-day basis. So like with the Federal Trade Commission, established in 1914 by Congress, they said, we're busy. We got to look at the whole world every day. So we're going to create this commission, and we're going to have 5 commissioners. And your job is to look out over the political economy and make sure there's no dangerous concentrations of power, and to regulate markets in ways that provide freedom and opportunity for people. And if we're going to keep track of what you're doing, we're going to watch over it. But your job is to go off and do that. So what happened is, over time, people forgot that the agencies were creations of Congress. And we just got used to the fact that, there's like a bunch of experts in these agencies who are doing this work. So because we are in such a crisis right now, and because the agencies have been so taken over by that philosophy of neoliberalism, they've been made subject to this anti-democratic philosophy of neoliberalism. The Congress has had to step back in and say, hey, agencies, the point was not just to whack the corporations in the face, it was also to say to the agencies, you guys have failed. We have to step back in. We're going to we're making a statement, you better listen, or we're going to restructure you in the agencies. We're going to change how you do things. We're going to force you to act. And that is Congress's job. It's very important. Anti-monopoly is not something technical. That was actually part of the neoliberal trick, is they said, don't worry your little heads about these laws. They're too complicated for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to hire a bunch of economists to figure this out. And you just go shopping. Don't worry about this. And now people woke up and realized, that didn't work. So we so people are actually learning these laws are fundamental to democracy, and better yet, we can understand them. They're really simple. They're the people's laws, and they just have like really simple rules, like, you know what? If you have, if you're an industrial corporation, if you got 25% of the market, that's enough. So there's, it's an amazing moment in American history as we reawaken to the nature of power and what to do about power, and just how sophisticated our own predecessors, our grandparents and great-grandparents were in dealing with power.
One of the things I noticed in the report is, it's talking about the various ways these companies abuse their power. And there is, in fact, a subheading that says bullying. So there's I think Cicilline and his committee did a really amazing job to talk about these behaviors that in real terms that everyone can understand, which I think was an sort of extraordinary part of what they achieved. We're starting to get some questions in, so you can put questions in the Q&A, and I'll try to keep an eye on the chat too, because I think we've got some that have come in there, but try to use the Q&A if you can. So here's one. Is the anti-monopoly movement just a left-wing thing?
That's no, it's not. I mean, anti-monopoly is right now today, and this is something people should understand, that the report that came out last week from the Cicilline committee, the minority in the House is the Republicans, and the minority within that subcommittee, they came out with their own report. Now, the New York Times said, "Oh, golly," there was, you go back and look at the coverage of that, and they said, "Oh, golly, the bipartisan nature of this committee has fallen down," and it's actually no. That was bogus. What you see if you read the minority report is almost complete agreement by the Republicans with the Democrats. The Republicans in that subcommittee said, "Hey, these corporations are threats to our democracy. They are threats to the American way of doing business, to American capitalism as we have understood it. And they're threats to, how we communicate, how we, speak to one another, how we run our press, our media, our news media." So no, Republicans are just as concerned about this today as Democrats. And we have seen, across the United States, here's another example. Every single state in the union, plus Washington, D.C., plus Puerto Rico, has opened an investigation of Google. Now, 20 of those states have Republican attorneys general. So this is not left. It's not right. This is the American people rising up and saying, we're going to have democracy. We're not going to be bossed around. We're not going to be pickpocketed. We're not going to be, have our beds and our houses stolen from beneath us. We're not going to have our hospitals destroyed. We're not going to have our healthcare destroyed. We're not going to be driven to an early grave through, addictions pushed on us by monopolists. We're going to live good lives, healthy lives, free lives. We're going to be in charge of our own country. We're going to be in charge of our own goddamn lives. And we are going to do this now.
What do you think? Another question coming is, do you think the Biden administration will have a different approach to antitrust than Trump? And what do you generally think about what might happen if we have a Biden administration?
You and I have had a lot of discussions about the Trump administration, and my own take on the Trump administration is there were serious people in the Trump administration who wanted to do something, especially about Google, Facebook, and Amazon. But like so many things in the Trump administration, they didn't have the ability to achieve what they wanted to achieve. Now, the president himself also sort of contributed to a perception that maybe these people weren't serious, but just the way he spoke about the power of Amazon, the power of some of these corporations, he politicized it in ways that were really, frankly, stupid. So I think the Biden administration will actually have because of the pathway forward that has been lighted by the Cicilline report, by the Cicilline committee, because of the work that is being done by the state AGs, the Biden administration has no choice but to deal with these problems. Now, there's a lot of talk about all the different folks that are coming in from the big corporations who are advising candidate Biden's his candidacy. Yeah, they're there. There's no doubt about that. But look ahead. There's just not much room for those folks to actually have real effect on what he does. So the main difference between the Trump administration and Biden administration is I think the Biden administration is going to actually set out to do this and have the ability to follow through.
That question came from Christopher Rowland, who also says congrats on the book. And we have another one from Jeff Morley, which is, what would these restructured tech giants actually look like? Would Google search be different than Google Ads? Would Apple iPhone be a different company than Apple laptop, and so on?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because this is something that we should all be taking part in. We should understand that anti-monopoly law is the people's law. And why is it the people's law? It's because, well, this is the people's country and it's our economy. And all corporations exist because they're functions of, they exist within a realm of law that we create. So we establish the rules for all corporations. What that means practically is we get to have what we want when it comes to the structure of the online economy, the online infrastructure. So if we want to have search as a separate function from email, we can have that. If we want to have the YouTube video monopoly separate from maps, like say Google Maps, we can have that. And we should look at Google, Facebook, and Amazon and think about how to restructure these corporations. But to really do that well, we should look beyond these corporations. We have to look beyond Godzilla and to like the land beyond, the space beyond, and say, what kind of world do we want? And because that's what anti-monopoly law is. It's how we design our economy. It's how we design our society. It's how we design our citizenship, and it's how we design our democracy. So now that we are pulling these tools out of the ground and sort of polishing off the rust and putting an edge on them, we can use them to build a fantastically better democracy, a fantastically better society than we have known in ever, really.
Some people have suggested that the way to deal with these tech monopolies in particular is to nationalize them. They should become publicly owned. What do you think about that?
It's, I'm not keen on the idea of, all the data that's collected by a platform where commerce takes place, or all the data that's collected by a search engine. And there's no way to not collect data. It's actually, data is sticky. Once you've built these things, the data is going to be someplace. I'm not that keen on the idea of the data being attached directly to the government. Or the power in any monopoly being attached to government. The American way has generally been to try and establish, when you have to have a monopoly, when you have to have something really big, you want it to be privately owned, but then regulated by the government. So you have an air gap where the people can watch the regulators and the private actors sort of engage with one another and decide how we want to direct this fight between the corporation and the government, because it's really up to us to direct the fight. So separation of state and private power is one of the ways that we have actually protected I believe, one of the ways we've protected our democracy. There are many examples of state monopolies that have worked pretty well over the years. The U.S. Postal Service worked really well for many years. So it's not impossible to make state monopoly work.
When you were talking about that, it reminded me of something that I've really learned from you, which is to think about anti-monopoly as like one of the basic checks and balances of a democratic government. You know, we know about the three branches and the ways that we keep power from accumulating in any one, and that this is how we deal with power in the private sector. I want to, with that sort of entry point, go back to something you said earlier in the conversation that's been kind of floating around in the back of my head, which is the Northwest Ordinance. You've done such a great job in the book of pulling these threads of American history and the great documents and thinking around anti-monopoly. Talk about the Northwest Ordinance and remind people what that is and how in the world that even fits into this conversation.
Yeah, no, it's something I never really thought much about myself. I mean, I remember it from history books when I was in 6th grade or 8th grade, or came upon it. And if you're reading a biography of somebody who was alive in that period, there were weird names out in the landscape. Case Western Reserve in Ohio. Is like, where does that come from? And but the Northwest Ordinance for many years, actually until about the turn of the last century, people routinely referred to this as the third of the founding documents. And what was so important about it was this was really the first law of the new nation. It was when after the Constitution, when the first Congress met in 1789, one of the first things, the very first laws they passed was the Northwest Ordinance. One of the very first laws that was signed into law by George Washington was the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance was a plan. It was like when America came to be. Now we can, let's understand, like there was the land of the old Northwest. This is the states of Ohio. We now know as Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and parts of Minnesota, is that these lands were our common lands as a new nation. Now, yes, those lands actually belonged to people who were living on them at the time, and Native American people, and they. But from the point of view of the folks in Washington, these were our common possessions, and so the people from the 13 states came together and said, what kind of society should we build in these new states? And the decision was, you go back and you look at it and it's like, what do we see? We see, first we're going to see citizen-sized farms. No family is going to have more than 160 acres of land. And we're not going to have any corporations running the land, and we're not going to have any speculators in the land system. And everyone's going to live in communities. You can't live willy-nilly across the land. We actually want all the people to live together, clustered in a town. In the center of each town, we're going to have a piece of land that's going to be for the school. Now, if you want to get together and build a church or a couple churches or 3 churches, you can do that. But you're going to have a school, and if you want a marketplace. And there's another thing we're going to have here. We're going to have no slavery in any of this land. So right at the beginning of America, the first law was no slavery. It said no slavery. Another thing, who gets to vote? Everyone gets to vote, no matter your color, no matter whether you've ever been enslaved in the past. That was in the first law. So what we see in the Northwest Ordinance was a vision in which an activist government was going to give people land and was going to establish them in communities. I mean, this was a type of social engineering. The first law of America was it was a social engineering law. But what were they engineering? What was the society they were engineering? They were engineering a society of independent, self-governing citizens. That's the lesson of the Northwest Ordinance, is our job is to use our government to engineer a world of independent, self-governing, free-thinking citizens who come together to deliberate in democratic systems.
One of the other great threads, and a reminder, please put your questions in the chat. I'm going to come back. There's one or two more I'm going to come back to, but if you have more as we come to the end here, drop them in. But one question, Barry, is there's a really great thread in your book about W.E.B. Du Bois. And I'm wondering if you talk a little bit about what history we learn from that and from him, and also about this moment of just racial reckoning around racial injustice and oppression and white supremacy, and how this is tangled up in monopoly power.
It's there's been a lot of talk about how sort of anti-monopoly fighters over the years that, well, it's all tied up in populism, and therefore it's sort of tainted by racism. And what we actually find, if you go back and study the post-war period, the post-Civil War period, Reconstruction, then after Reconstruction, and then the early years of the 20th century, is what you find is that is a world in which you had groups of Black citizens and groups of white citizens fighting for the same exact things: land, learning, and leadership, which is that, everyone is independent, everyone has education, and everyone can be part of leading the community in a democratic way. Now, the person who perhaps wrote about this most elegantly, most compellingly, most forcefully, in a perhaps I would say the most important book on democracy in the 20th century was W.E.B. Du Bois, who was this African-American scholar, just famous and brilliant man, who worked it was one of the founders of the NAACP, and he wrote a book in 1935 called Black Reconstruction, published the book in 1935, and it was ignored almost entirely at the time. But his point was to say, hey, the Civil War, Black folks weren't emancipated. Black folks liberated themselves. And here's the tools they did it with. Here's the ways in which they did it. These are the principles that inspired them to do it. These are the terrible people and the terrible concentrations of power they had to fight against to do it. These are all the lies that have been told. He's a historian, W.E.B. Du Bois, and one of the most important essays on American history is in the end of that book, Black Reconstruction, in which he just talks about how white people write Black people out of the history and write Black people's accomplishments out of history. So I would encourage everybody to get a copy of that book, to read that book. It is, in some ways, it's one of the refounding documents of America. It's a document. It's like in the same way that the Northwest Ordinance was one of the founding documents in the late 18th century. Black Reconstruction is one of the founding documents of refounding documents of American democracy in the 20th century. And it took me too long to find it. And I know that most people still ain't found it. And so it's for America now, with the fights that we're engaged in today, with the arguments that we're engaged in today, if you really want to understand structural racism, you got to understand the structure of corporate power. You can't deal with structural racism if you're not also dealing with structural corporate power. That's something that Du Bois understood fully. There is an amazing guide to fighting the fights that we need to fight today. It was written in 1935. And Du Bois is one of America's true heroes. He's too rarely viewed as the Democrat, the great populist, small d Democrat that he really was.
And I'm sure the folks at Politics and Prose would love to get everyone a copy of Black Reconstruction. So great recommendation. So a couple questions coming through in the Q&A. So talk a little bit about the Supreme Court. What happens if Dems take both chambers of Congress, pass an aggressive anti-monopoly legislation, and then they're stuck with the court?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question, because, you know, when every one of these fights over the court comes along, we tend to focus on you know, a few issues. I mean, this time we focused on Roe v. Wade, rightly so. You know, this is a fundamental right that may be taken away from half of Americans, and actually, just to really, if we understand it right, from all Americans. This time there's a lot of discussion about how this might affect the Obamacare, you know, but if you go back and look at the origins of the modern Republican GOP machine for identifying and getting into power particular justices, judges, and then justices on the Supreme Court, there's one test that they all have to pass before they pass any of these others. And that test is, do you believe in letting, in a law, and interpreting the law to allow people, a few people, to master everyone else? Or do you believe in interpreting the law to ensure that every citizen is free from mastery by anyone else? And the rule is that if you approve the former, that you will allow for there to be concentration of power. If you want the world to be run by corporations, then you are a GOP, someone that the GOP will vote into onto the Supreme Court. And there's actually, what's amazing right now is the GOP, as they wake up to this threat of monopoly, they're still putting pro-monopoly justices on the court. It is outrageous. And I hope the folks from the Republican Party actually wake up soon to what is really at stake on the Supreme Court.
We have a great question to end on, which is, what can ordinary, everyday people do to contribute to dismantling monopoly power?
Yeah, no, and this is something where, you and I have been doing this for so long, and we back when we could travel, we traveled all around this country talking to people in every state in this union. And I ain't never been to Alaska, but pretty much everywhere else. I'm sure you've been just about everywhere. But it's, and what people like, you see concentrated power, and you don't have any sense you can do anything about it. That's complete bunk. And just one thing, I work with a lot of people on Capitol Hill. When you call up Capitol Hill and you say, hey, I got these monopolists are messing up my town, they're messing up my agriculture, they're messing up my hospitals, they're spying on me, and they're collecting data on me. And when you send those kind of messages to people on Capitol Hill, it gets heard. It builds up. But think about what just happened in America just in the last year with this Google investigation. Every state in the union, plus DC, plus Puerto Rico, standing up and saying, we're going to investigate Google. We're going to investigate Facebook. We're going to bring cases against Google and Facebook. We're going to bring cases, we're going to bring cases that break their power. That was people, just like everybody listening to this, going to their state house, going to their town hall, calling, just using their power at home, not in Washington, and at home, and saying, you know what, if Washington ain't going to do this, we're going to do it. We're going to do it right here, right now. And we should just keep in mind that we keep fighting this fight, we will win. And not only will we take care of these terrifying corporations and free the technologies that they have monopolized, free these technologies so that we can use them in safe ways. We will have the tools we need to deal with climate change, to deal with the our all the dysfunction in our agriculture, with our healthcare, to promote peace around the world. Anti-monopolism is these are the tools that we use to make a world that works for us for generations and generations to come.
Barry, thank you so much for all your work in leading the way to that world over these many years. It's been absolutely tremendous. And the book is an incredible contribution to that. And I hope it is widely read. And here's to that victory and the restoration of American democracy and liberty from all masters.